Rejoice in the Lord always, I heard Paul say to me. But how can I rejoice with chaos all around me? Rejoice in the Lord always, Paul whispers in my ear. But then I hear the second verse, for the Lord is near. Present in the good, the bad, the in-between, present in the fear, present in both security and uncertainty, present with me here. Present when I wake and present when I sleep, present when I dance and present when I weep. Present always, the Lord is near. So I will rejoice, though the future is unclear. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Because the Lord my God is near, I raise my hands and lift my voice.
Pause for dramatic effect. My name is Hannah, and I'm the college minister here at First Humboldt, and I'm so glad that you guys are here with us this morning. If you haven't been here in a few weeks, we are right in the middle of a series on rejoicing. We've looked at what it means to say, rejoice in the Lord always. We say it again, rejoice. So we've talked about what it looks like to rejoice in different circumstances, where maybe it doesn't make the most obvious sense to rejoice. So rejoicing in the midst of grief, when that's difficult and we're remembering that the Lord is near to us. Rejoice in the midst of difficult financial circumstances, whatever that looks like. And this morning, we're going to look at another circumstance that rejoicing does not seem to be the most obvious answer. But I want to give you a little warning. This is kind of like a Christian curse word. So if you're a little sensitive, you may want to plug your ears or something, because we're not allowed to say this in church, all right? Because today, we're going to talk about doubt. And some of you are really scared of that word, and I get it, because we're not allowed to talk about that word in church, right? We can't admit that we have problems. We can't admit that we have questions. It's a little bit of a Christian curse word for us. But that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what does it mean to be a people who rejoice in the midst of doubt? We can define doubt as to be uncertain about something, to consider it questionable or unlikely, a hesitancy to believe, to distrust, to regard something with suspicion. And some of us are carrying some doubts. And if we're honest, we're carrying some doubts about God, some doubts about the church, some doubts about our faith or what we believe. We've got a lot of questions and some uncertainties and some things that we're struggling with. It's a lot like some of the food you may eat this week, where that one cousin brings that one dish and you say, thank you, and then you pile it in the back of the serving line and put the rolls in front of it because you're ashamed of it and you hope that nobody eats it, and you're just kind of oh yeah, look at all this great food that we have here. Don't look over here, that's fine. That's what we do with our doubt. We're a little ashamed of it. We're a little humiliated by it. We're hoping that our grandparents don't ask about it. It's not appropriate to talk about in front of company, and especially in the church sometimes. But the problem with our doubt is that it multiplies. It's not just one little question, right? Because what seems is like a little crack, the second you ask it, it's like opening up these double doors for all of the questions. And so your coworkers will be like, well, you're a Christian, so what about this? Or your parents will say well, what do you think about that? Or your friends will say, I've got a question about this thing, and you read this thing that didn't quite make sense, or this thing happened in the church that you're not quite sure of, or you're asking this question, and pile after pile, all the doubt just kind of seems to build up to this mountain until you're struggling to pick it up and put it on your back and be I'm fine, this is fine, it's okay. You're struggling under the weight of your mountain of doubt. And sometimes we can begin to feel like this picture. This is a picture of the fantasy story about the Titan god Atlas. You may be familiar with Greek mythology, and he was doomed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. This was his punishment. And throughout history, he's tried to kind of get out from underneath it, but he just can't. And so he's straining under this weight of the world. And this particular image sits in front of Rockefeller Center in New York City. Our doubt sometimes feels like this, doesn't it? Like it's a giant weight that we're carrying around that we don't really know how to get out from under. So how do we rejoice when we're carrying that around? What does it mean to be a person of faith when we've got a lot of questions? I think our story today might address that. We're going to be in Mark chapter 9. If you want to turn there or follow along with me, Mark chapter 9. But before we do that, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Because this story is about a miracle or a healing of Jesus. And I think sometimes when we read these stories that don't quite make logical sense to us, we get really caught up in the what and the how kind of questions. Like, how did this happen and what's going on? And it's weird and we're trying to wrap our heads around it. And I think sometimes we get so focused on that we miss the why. Why Jesus is doing or saying the things that he's doing. And so I hope this morning as we'll read, that we'll start asking, why is Jesus doing these things? So Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 14. Jesus has gone away with some of his disciples, and they've just come down off this mountain. Verse 14, it says, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes disputing with them. And when the whole crowd saw him, they were amazed and ran to greet him. And he asked them, what are you arguing with them about? And someone from the crowd answered him, teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they couldn't. He replied to them, you unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him to me. So Jesus comes with his friends and walks in on this chaotic scene. This man has brought his son to Jesus to be healed. But when he shows up, Jesus is gone. So he asks the disciples if they can do anything about it. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never had somebody assume that just because I have a relationship with Jesus, I can cure a demon. Anyone else have that experience? Please come tell me about it if you had. So why do they think the disciples can do something here? It's always kind of made me laugh a little bit. But I think if we look back in the previous chapters of Mark, we'll see that the whole book of Mark has really been about these disciples walking with Jesus as Jesus performs miracles and healings. And they've gotten close to Jesus. And in fact, they've gotten so close with Jesus that they've actually been able to do some pretty miraculous, cool things themselves because of the relationship they had with Jesus. So when Jesus isn't physically there, they say, okay, we'll take a crack at it. We've done this before. But they can't. And then Jesus says something that sounds really harsh to us. He's upset with the disciples. They don't have faith. They don't believe. And he's like, I've been with you this whole time. You've done this already. What's the breakdown here? What's going on? And that's an important question. What is going on with the disciples? Well, let's put a pin in that and come back to it later, because I think we'll get some more information if we keep reading. Mark 9, verse 20. So they brought the boy to Jesus. And when the spirit saw him, it immediately threw the boy into convulsions. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. How long has this been happening to him? Jesus asked the father. From childhood, he said. and many times it has thrown him into fire or water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If I can, everything is possible for the one who believes." And immediately the father of the boy cried out, "I do believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was quickly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And then it came out, shrieking and throwing him into terrible convulsions, and the boy became like a corpse, so that many thought, "He's dead." But Jesus, taking him by the hand, raised him and stood him up. That's a crazy story. But again, I think sometimes as we're trying to wrap our heads around it, we get really caught up in trying to figure out what is happening here and how did all this work and in what ways is this going on, and is this maybe like a modern day like epilepsy thing there's a lot of questions we could ask. But let's not lose sight of why. Why is Jesus doing this and saying these things? We see the Father express some doubts. Verse 22, he says, "If you can do anything." And that's a different conversation than the one he had. Remember at the beginning, he brought his son to Jesus because he thought Jesus could do something about it. But then he met the disciples. And when they messed up, he's not so sure about Jesus now. He's got some questions for him. He's maybe not so certain anymore. And you know what this is like. Because at one point you felt like your faith was so certain and you were so solid in the things. And then you met some Jesus people who maybe didn't act a whole lot like the Jesus you thought you knew. Or you heard some questions and you started to have some doubts. And maybe you're not quite so sure that Jesus can do what Jesus said he can do. We've been there, haven't we? And then in verse 24, in this beautiful declaration, he admits his doubts. He holds belief in one hand and unbelief in the other. "I believe, help my unbelief." And Jesus still responds to him. He still heals the son. He doesn't let this man's doubt get in the way. And that's confusing to us because we are sitting here hiding our doubt in a corner. We're humiliated and ashamed by it. And surely if people knew that we have all of these questions, that it would get in the way of Jesus. Surely these things would get in the way of our relationship with God, that it would be something shameful and humiliating. And it's confusing to us why Jesus doesn't respond here. Why is Jesus not deterred by this guy's doubt? I mean, come on. We are perfectly hiding ours, and this guy just out and says it, and Jesus heals the son? What's that about? I think this text is hard for us to wrestle with because we have understood doubt and faith as enemies. And I wonder if maybe the reason that doubt doesn't get in the way of Jesus working is because doubt and faith are not actually in competition with one another. What if doubt and faith can be held in two hands? We see this in Jesus' comments in verse 23. This almost exasperated, like, "If I can? Are you kidding me? If I can? Is there any good reason why I shouldn't?" And the father is sitting here going like, "Well, I've just expressed all of these doubts to you, so like, if you can do something with it, Jesus, go for it." And he's like, "You haven't given me a good reason not to." Because while the Father has doubts about Jesus, Jesus has never been bothered by the man's doubts. Doubting has never gotten in the way of what Jesus can do. Faith is not the absence of doubt. faith is not the absence of doubt, and we see that in the Father's exclamation in verse 24, I believe, help my unbelief. Doubt and faith are not in competition because they are exclaimed in the same breath. Jesus is not able to work a miracle in spite of the man's doubts, but because the doubts have never once overshadowed the faith. They work in tandem. Some of us, I think, need to be honest about our doubts. We need to pull the rolls out from behind them and say, I got some stuff. We need to give ourselves permission to pull our doubts out from the corners that we've been hiding them in. To be honest with ourselves and to be honest with God about where we've got questions, where we're uncertain about things. Friends, I think in my life I've spent more time wading in these waters of uncertainty than I ever have walking on the water with Jesus. And yet, he's met me there too. Some of us have believed the lie that Jesus is somehow unable to be present in our lives if we have doubt. But Jesus has never expected us to be perfect. He has never expected us to have it all figured out. I think he just wants us to be honest. So will you be honest this morning? With yourself first is maybe where it has to start. Are you willing to ask yourselves, okay, what are these questions that I've been ignoring? What are these things that I may need to take a closer look at? Can you be honest with yourself that you maybe don't have this Jesus thing all figured out the way you thought? And then, if you're willing, can you identify maybe one person in your life that you might be willing to share those doubts with? Nobody throw things at me. I'm not going to follow up with you. But a trusted Christian friend. Maybe someone from your life group. Maybe you catch me or another minister out in the hall after. Can you share these doubts with one person and just be honest about them? And trust that faith and doubt are not in competition. Faith is not the absence of doubt. But if that's the case, why couldn't the disciples do something? I told you we'd come back to this. Why couldn't the disciples perform a miracle? Remember how Jesus calls them unbelieving. Why would their lack of faith give them an inability to perform when Jesus has just proved that doubt is really not that big of an issue for him to work through? I think we get a clue in his statement in verse 23 where he says, everything is possible for the one who believes. Everything is possible for the one who believes. That sounds like a really cute saying, right? Like it's very flowery. Like I could put that on a little pillow or on a little canvas on my home. Everything is possible for the one who believes. That's what we read this as. And I think part of it is because we internalize it, right? We say that everything is possible for me because I believe. Everything is possible for me when I believe. But I don't actually think that's what's being said here. See, this phrase is actually really important in the book of Mark. It's used 3 times, and we only see it show up one other time in the New Testament. So as we're thinking through why is Jesus doing and saying these things, this is an important phrase to hone in on. Everything is possible, not for you who believes, but everything is possible for God, according to the one who believes. That verse is saying that somebody who believes in God will not put limitations on what God can and cannot do. It doesn't matter your circumstances. It doesn't matter your experiences. The person who walks in faith will not put limits on what God can do. Everything is possible for God according to the one who believes. Faith has more to do with our trust in God's ability than it ever has had to do with our own doubts or shortcomings. And I think this is affirmed in what Jesus says in verse 28. Look with me. After the others had gone into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive him out?" And he told them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer." See, he's demonstrating to them that their doubt wasn't what kept them from being able to perform a miracle. It was their inability to recognize why they were able to do it to begin with. They forgot that the reason they were able to work a miracle, they were able to participate in any of these things, was because of the relationship they'd had with Jesus all along. It was because of the communion they had with God. They were working hand in hand with Jesus the whole time. And yet here, they forgot. It reminds me of our passage in Philippians. We've based our whole series around this passage. It says this, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving," catch this, "present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." We rejoice because in every situation, we can go to God in prayer. The Lord is near. The Lord does see. The Lord does hear. The Lord does act. And God's action has never been limited by our doubt. Let your requests be made known to God, no matter what you're holding in your hands. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is having a commitment to Jesus, even in the midst of doubt. It is holding on to Jesus, no matter your circumstances or the things that you are carrying. When our doubt piles up, and we are shouldering it on our own, or we're hiding it away in shame, we are given permission to bring it out, to be honest about it, and to trust that it's not going to get in the way of what God can do. It doesn't disqualify our faith. Do you trust that Jesus is faithful to show up no matter your circumstances, no matter your doubts? We talked at the beginning about how our doubt kind of just piles up. It can feel like this mountain, this huge burden that we're like carrying on our shoulders, and we can begin to feel a little like this. Like we've got these questions and they're weighing on us, and unlike Atlas, we're probably not gonna get biceps out of it. We're struggling with our doubt, wishing we could just get rid of it. But this statue stands in front of Rockefeller Center in New York City. And right across the street is St. Patrick's Cathedral. And behind the altar of this place of worship in the cathedral is this picture. It's an infant baby Jesus holding the world in his hands. This doubt, is this what you were worried about? If I can, I got it. Give it to me. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is a commitment to Jesus, even in the midst of doubt. And friends, that is worth rejoicing over. Will you give it to him? Will you trust that he can handle it? Would you join me in prayer? Would you take just a second and reflect on your own doubt? What fears or questions or uncertainties are you carrying in your life? Will you take a second and be honest about them with yourself? I wonder if there's someone that you might be willing to open up to about them. Someone you trust. Maybe a friend in your life group. Is there someone you can open up to about these questions and concerns you have? Will you be honest about your doubts with Jesus? Will you put them on display and trust that he's still going to move and still going to work? Will you trust that Jesus can handle them? God, we believe. Help our unbelief.